This video is brought to you with the support of TrueFire. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World, where to help you get the most music from the least gear. Fender spent most of the 1950s furiously innovating their electric guitar line. However, when it came to the electric bass, the pace of progress was comparatively slow. The precision bass was launched in '51, and it moved to its new split pickup identity in '57. Around that time, Leo and company began to imagine a new deluxe bass guitar, which would become the Fender Jazz Bass. So if you've always wanted to follow the history from start to reissue, then you're in the right place, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of the Fender Jazz Bass. If you like this style of video, be sure to subscribe. And to support what we do, grab a t-shirt, hoodie, or a 5-Watt World Barber Collaboration overdrive pedal. To become an even bigger part of 5-Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5-Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. And if you've always wanted to have your own YouTube channel but didn't know where to start, buy my YouTube Mastery for Musicians course. It's all the things I wish I knew when I started. All the links are in the description. Much like the Stratocaster guitar being issued as an upscale revision of the Telecaster, by '59, Fender was ready to release a bass in the lineup above the Precision. Originally slated to be called the Deluxe Bass, they moved to calling it the Jazz because they were in hopes of attracting upright players looking to double on electric. Fender began building them in March of 1960. They were priced in stock sunburst finish for the kingly price of $279.50. Don Randall, the head of marketing and distribution company, noted, "We were always market-driven after establishing the fact that the bass guitars would sell and that people wanted them. Then the next thing was to make a prettier one, a more elaborate one. We wanted an upscale model to put on the market. The Jazz Bass wasn't Leo's idea particularly. It was more of a marketing idea, something that we wanted in order to expand the line." So it was an idea that came out of Don Randall's marketing and sales division, and like the Stratocaster, it would be Randall that named it the Jazz Bass. Ironically, and somewhat understandably, upright players often preferred the wider neck of the Precision bass when they moved over to an electric. Whatever the naming and marketing motivation, the Jazz Bass was an aesthetic evolution of the ideas started in the Precision. Compared to a Precision bass, the Jazz has a slightly larger body, made of alder or occasionally of ash. The increased size meant the Jazz basses were often a little heavier, and the extra mass provided more resonance. It featured the offset waists of the Jazzmaster guitar that Fender had launched as its new premier model in '58, making it more comfortable to play sitting down, as most serious players tended to do at the time. It also had a narrower string spacing at the nut, giving the neck a more tapered feel. The Jazz Bass was 1 7/16 at the nut, whereas the Precision was a full 1 3/4 inches. Consequently, many guitarists switching over to bass felt that the Jazz Bass neck was more manageable. But the biggest and most visible difference was that it had 2 pickups instead of 1, providing tonal versatility not to be found on the Precision. The Jazz Bass prototype had large soap bar-style single-coil pickups similar to those of a Jazzmaster guitar, but they couldn't get those to produce the tone that Leo Fender was looking for. While the neck pickup provided the warm, round sound similar to a Precision, the real driver was the added bridge pickup that produced a mid-range punch and trebly high end that was new to Fender basses. In 1960, the first Jazz basses were released with a standard sunburst finish and a tortoiseshell-style pickguard. They had a 21-fret, slab-style rosewood fingerboard with clay dots on a maple neck. The finger rest was mounted below the G-string, continuing with Leo's assumption that players would rest their fingers there and pluck the strings with their thumb or play with a pick. Foregoing the string-through body, there was a top-loader bridge, and there were individual adjustable mutes for each string mounted to the body. There was the often-removed covers over the front pickup and the bridge. The first Jazz basses were released with dual concentric control pods. Fender referred to them as tandem volume and controls, and they were generally referred to as stack knobs. This control layout has similar function to what you'd find on a 2-pickup Gibson guitar, like a Les Paul. There were 2 stacks, 1 for each pickup, with each on a tone control on top and a volume control underneath. Each tone knob was notched and had 10 different positions. Along with the 2 volume controls, you could mix the 2 pickups in very different ways. Though these controls weren't popular at the time, This layout caught on more recently with players like session ace Bobby Vega and the Red Hot Chili Peppers bassist Flea because of the variety of available sounds. The Fender Flea signature basses, like this road-worn version here, have these stack control knobs. Fender began tweaking the jazz bass almost immediately. Between 60 and 61, 2 additional patent numbers were added to the headstock decal, and by December of 61, they changed the control layout to the now classic 3 knobs, 2 larger volume knobs for each pickup, and a smaller master tone control. This was back to the layout they'd used on the prototype of all things. Stack knob jazz basses continued to be built well into 62, using up the parts that were in stock, and this sometimes leads to confusion about aging basses and when the changes were actually made. In 61, Fender began offering 14 custom colors, many with matching headstocks, and most of these were released with white nitrocellulose pickguards. The slab rosewood fingerboards would last until late in 62, when they would be moved to a thinner, almost laminate curved fingerboard. These would be the last slab rosewood fingerboards Fender would make until the authentic reissues in the early 80s. The slab board basses have a different sound altogether, warmer and rounder than the laminate boards. Players that made the 62 jazz bass famous include John Paul Jones and, of course, Jaco Pastorius. In 63, the individual string mutes mounted on the body were replaced with an all-string mute glued to the inside of the bridge cover. 64 was the last year before Fender was sold to CBS. That model would have the laminate fingerboard, and during 64 they transitioned from the original clay dot inlays over to pearl dots on the neck. From 66 on, there were a lot of changes, as CBS was basically just trying to see what the market would like. One of the first was to move to a bound fingerboard, and in 66 saw the first year of the lollipop tuners that were built in-house at Fender. In 67, Fender switched from dot markers to the pearl block markers on the neck. And by 68, the clover knobs were back on the tuners. Also by 1968, the strap buttons on the back of the headstock had finally gone away, moving to the top of the horn. In 69, a larger and bolder logo decal appeared. Also in 69, a maple fingerboard bound in black with black block markers was introduced as an option. By the mid-60s, soul sessions at Atlantic that didn't feature Chuck Rainey on his precision bass probably had Jerry Jemmett on his 65 jazz bass. Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, King Curtis, B.B. King, and countless others relied on Gemmett's bass. Jemmett said of the jazz bass, "I never wanted to depart from my jazz roots, so the name alone was an inspiration to me. And the character of the sound, a raw, punchy, tight, cutting tone, was great for the syncopation, ghost notes, and dynamics I was playing." In a 1984 interview, Jaco Pastorius said of Jemmett, "He was my idol, making the sounds I wanted to make." Early in his career, Jack Cassidy played a Fender jazz bass with the Jefferson Airplane. The propulsive groove of White Rabbit and the weaving lines of Somebody to Love were both on his jazz bass. Led Zeppelin's John Paul Jones can be heard playing his jazz bass on Dazed and Confused and Good Times, Bad Times. And in 68, James Brown was putting together a new band and it included an 18-year-old Bootsy Collins playing his new block inlay, Sunburst jazz bass. I've been using TrueFire for years, so they're the perfect partner for 5-Watt World. Like a lot of guitar players, I'm interested in all kinds of music. TrueFire always has something to scratch the itch I have for learning more about guitar. To take full advantage of the variety, I've always subscribed to the All Access Pass, which lets me use everything in the TrueFire catalog. As a viewer of 5-Watt World, you can get an exclusive 50% discount on the All Access Pass, or you can get 35% off any course in the catalog by using the dedicated links in the description. I've learned so much from TrueFire that I'm confident that you can too. Sign up using the links in the video description to support 5-Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. It was around this time that Larry Graham of Sly and the Family Stone fame is credited with developing the first slapping technique on his jazz bass he nicknamed Sunshine. When the drummer in his trio left unexpectedly, he began hitting the lower strings with his thumb to cover the bass drum part. He'd also pluck high strings with his index finger to simulate the snare and the backbeat. He said he wasn't looking to create a great innovation. He was just looking to, quote, keep his job, end quote. Out of necessity came a new way of playing that would be instrumental in creating funk. Like Rocco Prestia from Tower of Power on his modified Precisions, Verdine White of Earth, Wind & Fire was a great funk fingerstylist, but over on the jazz bass. His fluid lines and sophisticated harmony gave away his jazz and classical music background. Though they were used by many players in the 60s, it was truly the 70s when the jazz bass came into its own. This was the time of Larry Graham, John Paul Jones, Barry Oakley, Will Lee, and Anthony Jackson. All were forming their personal styles on a jazz bass. All of these artists were part of the transition in New York City from the precision to the jazz as the studio musician's bass of choice in that decade. Will Lee would switch to a jazz bass after his beloved precision was lost in an apartment fire. He said the two-pickup configuration of the jazz bass is the most practical design for bassists. Its sonic versatility enables players to seamlessly glide to and from different styles of music while affording the choice between sounding fat and round or thin and nasally. In 1972, there was a change that you might not notice at a glance, but would make a profound difference in tone on the jazz bass. The bridge pickup was moved 4/10 of an inch closer to the bridge, giving the bridge pickup much more bite. Perhaps this is why Rush's Geddy Lee has gravitated to post-72 style jazz basses. Geddy's main riff on YYZ is unquestionably one of the most recognized jazz bass recordings of all time. By 74, Fender had started to transition from the 4-bolt neck plate to a 3-bolt with a micro-adjust tilt. Around the same time, the bullet truss rod was introduced. This allowed truss rod adjustments to be made without removing the neck from the guitar. Also, in 76, the headstock logo was changed yet again, and the serial numbers moved from the neck plate up onto the headstock. In 77, the control knobs were changed to black plastic with numbers. By the late 70s, the fact that the jazz bass was slightly heavier to start with was exaggerated by the heavier wood used by Fender to build the bodies, creating some particularly beastly examples. And just as the jazz bass was becoming the tool of choice for many, along came Jaco. You can't talk about the jazz bass or electric bass at all without spending some time talking about Jaco Pastorius. He'd started on drums, but after breaking his wrist playing football, he'd switched over to bass, and it wasn't long after that he'd proclaim himself to be the world's greatest bass player. Though an outrageous thing to claim, by many accounts, it was true enough. Though Jaco claimed at times that his first jazz bass was a 1960 model, early photos show him holding an instrument with block inlays that would date it as being in late 66 or early 67 at the earliest. But then Jaco was famous for telling stories in interviews, always the entertainer. But in the early 70s, Jaco acquired the 62 jazz bass that became known as the Bass of Doom, on which he recorded most of his best-known music. Reversing the direction of Leo Fender started with the precision bass, he pulled the frets out of the fingerboard, filled the fret slots with wood putty, then to protect the fingerboard from the roto-sound, round-wound strings he used, he coated it with several layers of marine epoxy. This created a smooth, hard surface that gave his bass a unique and singing quality. He said of his proficiency on the fretless, "It's like I'm the first guy to be using a fretless bass and really getting down and play it, because nobody can play it. They cannot play it in tune. I play in tune, like a cello player." Beyond playing things on the fretless that bassists are still trying to do on their fretted instruments, among Jaco's many innovations was playing a rolling 16th note style he learned from playing in R&B bands in southern Florida. It gave Jaco's lines tremendous momentum. He also mastered the use of both natural and artificial harmonics as a way of extending the range of the bass. This was enhanced by his heavy use of the bridge pickup and added to his use of the fretless with its ability to slide between notes to create fluid lines, while it allowed him to drive bands with profound rhythmic accuracy. He'd play double stops that helped to fill out his parts like Hendrix had done on guitar. And also following in Hendrix's footsteps, he developed a huge and flamboyant stage presence. After a dramatic audition for Blood, Sweat, and Tears drummer Bobby Colomby, Colomby recommended him to Epic Records and Jaco signed a solo deal. The result was the 1975 album simply titled Jaco Pastorius. It is without a doubt the most influential and important electric bass record ever made. It showed that the Fender jazz bass could be used as a lead voice in an ensemble and that there was seemingly no limit to the expression possible with the instrument. Coincidentally released 25 years after the release of the first Fender Precision in '51, it was more than Leo had ever dreamed of for his creation. Sadly, we lost Jaco all too soon. He passed on September 21st, 1987. It's a bit of a sign of how out of touch Fender had become by the mid-'70s, that even at the height of Jaco's popularity, they didn't offer a fretless jazz bass, though they'd offered a fretless Precision as early as '70 as a bit of an experiment. Their first fretless jazz bass didn't come out until 1988. Quality at Fender had slipped, but more importantly, relying on musicians to inform the company of the direction, as Leo had done, was lost to Fender at the time. This trend was finally reversed when CBS hired Bill Schultz to revamp the company in 1982. The first thing Schultz did with his new team was to start what is now referred to as the Fullerton Reissues project. They began buying up vintage instruments to use as models. Studying these originals, they set about creating reissues in the original machines in the Fullerton factory. They built 3 basses in the reissue series, including a 62-style jazz bass. The reissues were accurate in most all details, though collectors would note that the 12th fret dot markers were slightly closer together than the originals, and that they chose to use the stack knob controls from the 60 and 61 basses. From 82 to 84, the US standard J bass changed to single-ply white pickguard that incorporated the original metal control plate to save money. They also switched to white knobs and pickup covers at the same time. The neck binding and black inlays went away. This was also the first time you could get a jazz bass with a solid maple neck. In 1985, CBS sold Fender to an investor group headed by then-President Bill Schultz. They continued to restore quality and once again started listening to artists for inspiration and modifications. It was at this time that the first fretless jazz bass was produced, including a custom shop special Jaco Pastorius Relic jazz bass. Though not initially popular with the jazz musicians that the name seemed to be targeting, the jazz bass had gone on to be embraced by an endless number of players and an equally endless number of styles of music. Fender has released more signature jazz bass models than any other guitar in their line, including Marcus Miller, Reggie Hamilton, Victor Bailey, Steve Bailey, and of course, the Jaco model. Darryl Jones, who leapt on the scene in the mid-'80s in gigs with Miles Davis, Sting, and the Rolling Stones, said of the jazz bass, "I discovered that the original passive electronics of the early jazz bass allowed them to be heard in a way that basses with active electronics sometimes cannot be heard, particularly in larger venues. There's an immediacy of sound with passive instruments. I call it bark. Just another aspect that Leo got so right." Still, the wave of active electronics and basses in the 90s touched on the jazz bass as well. Marcus Miller is likely the player that put the active jazz bass tone in front of the largest audience. Miller remembers, "The active idea came from Roger Sadowski, who was maintaining my basses. He recommended and installed the preamp to give me some control of my sound in the fast pace of the studio. When I listen back now, I really hear the difference in tone, growly before the preamp and more rounder after. Best of all, it was still the sound of the jazz bass, with a little bit of steroids." The first Fender 5-string bass, tuned B to G, was released as an American Deluxe Jazz Bass 5 in 1995. It had a downsized body, a 22-fret neck, and it featured abalone dotted inlays. As we came to the 2000s, Fender had 9 different jazz bass models in the line. This included the Lux bass that came out around 2005. One of the most notable modern users of the jazz bass is Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Fender released a Flea signature bass in 2016 that was a recreation of his 61 stack knob jazz in a faded, rare, custom color shell pink. Mars Volta bassist Juan Alderete is a fan of the subtleties you can pull from the jazz bass. In an interview in Bass Player magazine, he said, "The jazz bass was what my heroes, Jaco and John Paul Jones, played, so I set out to follow their lead. Initially, I was drawn to the deep bass response of both pickups, but once I realized that Jaco favored the rear pickup, it changed my whole approach to music. Harmonics, string scratching, and how feedback sounded all came to light for me. Sonically, the jazz bass sits solidly with the bass drum. Overall, the bass became meaner and more profound in the band when the jazz bass came on the scene." If you were into Jimi Hendrix, you were listening to a jazz bass in either Noel Redding or Billy Cox's hands. The extraordinary bass breaks that John Entwistle played on The Who's My Generation were recorded on a jazz bass after he'd broken the strings on 3 successive Dan Electros he'd wanted to use. Ron Blair with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Adam Clayton and U2, and UK session great Herbie Flowers, and all of it was recorded on a jazz bass. Those of you that have watched this series over time know that I often turn to Tony Bacon's excellent guitar books in my research for these videos. When Tony published The Bass Book with Barry Morehouse, it was a Fender jazz bass that they put on the cover. And I think that probably says it all. So who's your favorite jazz bass player? Put it in the comments for everyone to enjoy. If you like this video, you probably like my short history of the top 10 Fender jazz bass players that changed the world. I want to thank my pal Dino Monoxylus for setting aside his jazz bass style Lakeland to play a buddy's vintage 76 Fender jazz bass for the video, through his Ampeg Heritage SVT. Of course. I need to thank the guys at Vintage Guitar Oldenburg for permission to use the clips of Detlef Blanc playing the beautiful vintage jazz basses they've had through over the years. I leaned heavily on 3 books for this one: How the Fender Bass Changed the World by Jim Roberts, The Fender Jazz Bass by J.W. Black and Albert Molinaro, and The Bass Book by Tony Bacon and Barry Morehouse. I want to thank everyone that stopped by the online store and grabbed some merch or a 5-watt World Barber Electronics Collaboration overdrive. You keep the channel going. In particular, I need to thank the Friends of 5-Watt on Patreon. It's the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5-watt World. I just make the videos. If you like the style of video, be sure to subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Thanks for hanging with me until the end. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5-watt World.